As the great Prince once said, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to get through this thing called life." I, for one, am firmly convinced that Socrates was right when he said that unexamined life is not worth living. And so as part of understanding our life together is understanding our society, and specifically our society's economic system. So today I want to introduce you to the history of economics and capitalism. Economics is essentially the science of how humans choose to use their resources, both individually and collectively in societies. In essence, it is the science of choice. So where exactly did free market capitalism come from? It's an interesting saga. If you were born 500 years ago or more, anywhere in the world, but particularly in Europe, from which the US economic model is derived, you would have a vastly different belief about the pursuit of wealth. And you would also have been under the rule of a monarch or other ruler, and laws that are guided by those rulers' interests, as well as probably the church and powerful guilds that protect business interests. There would have been very little scientific curiosity, and every town would have had its own currency and ways to measure things. All of these things make it really hard for a market system like capitalism to work. Free market capitalism is essentially a bottom-up system in which nobody at the top is deciding how or what society will make. And so how did we get from there to here? Well, there's changes in beliefs about pursuing wealth, there's destruction of old institutions, there's increase in scientific curiosity, and the development of infrastructure like roads and bridges and unified measurements. So if economics is a science of choice, how come economics is a relatively young discipline? Most people say that economics is only a few hundred years old. How is that possible since humans have been around for much longer? Well, until fairly recently in human history, we were living at the subsistence level. That means there really isn't any choice. You either collect tubers and hunt for meat or die. Inasmuch as there were groups of people in miniature little societies, they were organized mostly around food. There's no need to study and theorize about how people make choices when there basically are no choices. But then around 10,000 years ago, we don't know exactly when, something very interesting happened. In the first agricultural revolution, people started to figure out how to cultivate crops, and this meant that we moved from hunting and gathering to living in towns and doing agriculture. There were other agricultural revolutions, notably the Arab agricultural revolution starting in the 8th century with the invention of advanced farming techniques, and in Europe starting in the 17th century. But the original agricultural revolution was the one that really changed the course of humanity. This meant that we started specializing in certain crops, getting really good at producing corn or wheat or eggs. That means there are large increases in food supply and output, and we begin to see gains in the standard of living. This idea of specialization, where people specialize in one task or one type of production, and learn how to be very productive at it, is one of the key foundations of modern economic growth. And this is what starts free market capitalism. But when you have a stable population and growing food supplies and the beginnings of free time for some people, new dangers emerge. Can you guess what they are? People start stealing other people's stuff. This can get really big and organized, especially as better weapons develop. Leaders can gather fighters and soldiers to go take over big chunks of other people's land. Since most people are poor and vulnerable and don't want to be attacked, die, or live as a slave, societies begin to be set up and ordered so that stability and protection are the most important. Feudal systems in the East and West reflect this. You work the land for someone else in exchange for protection. This type of society, organized around protection, can lead to stagnation, both because when your focus is so much on stability and protection, there's no energy or incentive to innovate. And remember that innovation often causes disruption, and disruption is unwelcome when there's so much danger about. Also, stagnation comes when there is such inequality of power between the few lords and kings who are getting wealthier and wealthier, and the majority of the population, serfs, were staying very, very poor. There's some theory that, as awful as the Black Plagues were in Europe, one of the benefits was that it reduced the workforce so much that landlords had to start paying workers more because workers were so scarce. And that starts the economic growth, and that starts all sorts of good things happening later on. Remember that the Catholic Church, at least in Europe, is very powerful and entwined with the kings and queens, and helping to make the laws of the land. In part because the Bible generally looks down on greed, and because so much of the focus is on conquering or losing land, there is this prevailing sense that all transactions have what we call a zero-sum game. The idea of a zero-sum game is important, but mistaken. If you believe that everything is a tug of war and your gain can only come at someone else's loss, trade with other people is seen as bad. Innovation that disrupts and takes business away from others is bad. Charging people interest on loans is sinful. Good governments surely will not reward entrepreneurship, loans, and trade between people or between countries. The modern view is that there can be gains to both sides in a transaction. For instance, if I buy a used remote control car on Craigslist, I walk away feeling like a winner. Whoa! And so does the seller. Yeah, we are both better off than before. So in the early 1500s, Martin Luther launches the Protestant Reformation, and the powerful Catholic Church begins to lose its dominance. This is interesting because the Church begins to recede in its role of setting laws. But also, the Protestants have their own unique view on the pursuit of wealth. Although the pursuit of wealth is seen as sinful and is pretty much illegal for most of human history, that's about to change. The Protestant work ethic begins to look approvingly on hard work and its rewards. If hard work is good for the soul, and hard work sometimes brings material rewards, then material rewards can be seen as a sign of a godly life. Simply having wealth doesn't necessarily mean you're evil anymore. Of course, this can get twisted into some modern versions. We sometimes observe or see or argue that people with wealth are assumed to be hardworking and deserving of that wealth. There are lots of problems with this, not the least of which it completely ignores luck and advantages at birth that some have. Nevertheless, the Protestant Reformation ushered in the beginning of the change of heart about pursuing wealth. Pursuing wealth began to be looked upon with favor for the first time. Another thing that happens that is part of this perfect storm that results in the Industrial Revolution and all modern economic growth is the Italian Renaissance. The rebirth of human curiosity and the idea that inventions of the mind can be beautiful and useful is clearly a super important step to get us from the old world to the modern world. Leonardo da Vinci's prolific inventions of war and other machines are going to inspire many other inventions. This becomes almost systematic. You're looking at a water wheel. One of the hallmarks of the Industrial Revolution is the rapid development of revolutionary new labor-saving technologies. All of the first megacities are built on rivers, and they specialize in textile production. For instance, because one of the first inventions is this water wheel that harnesses moving water to create power for looms and sewing machines. This is going to change everything. Here's a partial list of some of the key inventions of the Industrial Revolution from around 1750 to 1850-ish. The spinning jenny. The spinning jenny that handles fibers and turns them into thread. The steam engine. The locomotive. The telegraph. The power loom. The cotton gin for removing seeds from cotton. The sewing machine. The incandescent light bulb. The typewriter. The photograph. And you can see that the world is turned on its head. Many of the inventions fundamentally change how society works, and especially how production happens. Now you have power and light for large factories. This alone wouldn't have changed anything except there were lots of poor people without other options. In England, for instance, the system of farming, where everyone could farm on common or public lands, was breaking down because the rich were beginning to force laws that enclosed these lands, the enclosure movements, and made them unavailable to everybody else. Part of the reason for this was the increase in the price and profitability of wool made farming sheep more profitable than growing crops. At any rate, you had large numbers of desperately poor people wandering the countryside, a very nice resource for factory owners who needed to hire cheap labor. Another thing that happened is that people began to think of their labor as separate from themselves, disembodied labor, so to speak. Today, you probably think about your identity as many different things, but that you have choices when it comes to where you will work, what kind of labor you will do, etc. That is a relatively new thing for people to think about. But the market system, or capitalism, requires that resources like labor be mobile and fluid enough to move to wherever they are wanted and needed most by society. And in fact, this is the big question. How will societies be set up? How will we make sure that there's enough food and clothing, enough education, the right types of investments? We can no longer rely on monarchs or other systems of authority, or the church. They have all receded. What is left to get people to produce the things needed for other people? How should we figure out what to produce, how we should produce it, and who should get it? This is the question on everyone's minds in this era of massive upheaval. All the old ways of doing things are gone. We're not sure if we're going to make it through. Do not fear, Scotland to the rescue. Here comes Adam Smith, a moral philosopher, a lifelong bachelor, a professor, somebody who was kidnapped as a toddler and then inexplicably released, well loved by his students. Writes a few books. The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was the most popular one in his lifetime, but the one that matters to us is The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. This book would become the birth of economics. And in it, he outlines the philosophy of capitalism and free markets this way. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that I expect my dinner, but from his regard to his own self-interest. It is truly a revolutionary idea that society can rely on nothing but the self-interest of its people to create the industries and the production and the distribution that provides an orderly way for society to meet its own needs. Adam Smith saw through the chaos and argued that we didn't need to return to monarchs or other authority structures, like many people wanted, to order society, but that we could rely on the invisible hand of the market to meet our needs. Smith saw that the invisible hand of the market would guide self-interest into providing for the common good. This led him to advocate for laissez-faire, which is French for leave it alone, so leave the market alone to do its thing. However, the second part of the invisible hand often gets forgotten or ignored, and in fact requires a lot of government intervention to protect. The second part of the invisible hand is competition. It is not enough to rely on self-interest to provide for the common good if you have no competition. For instance, if everything you bought was produced by a monopoly or single seller, what would your prediction be about the price and quality of those goods? Mainstream economic theory argues that monopolization, in which there is no competition, leads to lower quality and higher prices and a reduced standard of living for everyone, except maybe the monopoly owner and his friends. Businesses prefer to have no competition and will work actively to prevent it. Adam Smith said this. And therefore the government and policy and law is the only thing that can protect robust competition. In fact, one of the rising concerns in the U.S. today amongst economists is that over the past few decades, we've gotten a lot more large businesses and lost a lot of small firms. And so the level of competition overall is in decline in the U.S. There are real problems with this, as larger corporations can lobby Congress and protect themselves from further competition through law. And it could be a reason why workers' wages have been stagnant over the last 40 years, and yet corporate profits are high and rising. This is not the form of capitalism that would make Adam Smith happy or proud. And in part, this is probably one of the reasons why no country ever practices pure capitalism or free markets. Even Adam Smith saw major flaws in markets and argued for government intervention where markets fail. So we can say that Adam Smith described the philosophy and beauty of free market capitalism and also understood its flaws, and we should too. And so modern economies practice or try to practice the best of free market capitalism, but adding in elements of government intervention in markets where they fail. For instance, around social safety nets, providing education, subsidizing or providing health insurance in most countries, not the US, and other things. We can more clearly call most economies mixed economies, a mix of free market capitalism and government intervention. Some would call that socialism. It may be safest to just say mixed capitalism or managed capitalism.